violence between Israel and Palestinians has escalated rapidly. There have been clashes at the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. Hamas is launching rocket attacks on Israel. Israel's carrying out airstrikes in Gaza. And the funerals have begun, with deaths on both sides. These tensions reach back decades, but why have they escalated now? Well, there are many reasons. Here are 6. The first concerns growing Palestinian protests. The next reason is the calendar. This year, the end of Ramadan has coincided with several important dates for Israelis. The next factor is politics. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's under pressure. After the recent election, his rivals are now trying to form a new government. And Palestinian politics is also deeply divided. Hamas controls Gaza, Fatah controls the West Bank. Recent elections were postponed, much to Hamas's frustration. More broadly, Palestinians have felt marginalised after the US brokered the Abraham Accords. This normalised relations between Israel and the UAE and Bahrain. And so while neither Hamas or Mr. Netanyahu would put it this way, a conflict could serve political purposes for both. Bear all of that in mind, the protests, the dates, the politics, as we turn to the next factor. What happened in Jerusalem on Monday? Israeli police clashed with thousands of Palestinians in the compound of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Over 300 Palestinians and 20 police were injured. And this is all at a site which is hugely sensitive. It's sacred to Jews and Muslims. Afterwards, Israel blamed extremists. Palestinian leaders called it brutal. Hamas in Gaza was watching these events. Our 5th factor was its decision to act. On Monday, around 6 p.m. local time, it began firing rockets. Israel swiftly launched multiple strikes in return, and this has continued. Hundreds of Hamas rockets, hundreds of Israeli airstrikes. Hamas and Israel's long-time animosity is playing out once more. And as it has, our 6th factor has also been on show, the rhetoric being used by both sides. Language like that makes escalation more likely. Put all of that together and we start to explain the situation. But let's be clear, underneath recent events remains the long-term failure of Israel, the Palestinians and the world to find a lasting peace. And that failure explains what we're seeing now and why we'll see it again.
Hello world, I'm John Bruni and you're listening to Strategicon, your window to all things security and foreign affairs. Benjamin Netanyahu has been in office as Prime Minister of Israel twice, once between 1996 to 99, and then from 2009 to today. Netanyahu has been the steady, though controversial, hand at the helm of Israel for 15 years. During this time, Israel's foreign and security policies have been characterized by opposition to a two-state solution with Palestine, expansion of Jewish settlements at the expense of Palestinians, fortifying Israel's critical bonds to the United States, and complete opposition to the Iranian theocracy, actively containing its nuclear program, as well as crippling Iran's ties to terrorist groups such as Hezbollah, Hamas, Palestinian Jihad, while also attacking Iranian interests in Syria. To discuss this and more this evening, we are joined from London by Professor Yossi Merkelberg. Yossi is Senior Consulting Research Fellow for Chatham House's Middle East North Africa program. Yossi, welcome to Strategicon.
Good evening and thank you for having me.
Yossi, Prime Minister Netanyahu has been very hawkish in relation to the Palestinians. While it's never been explicitly stated that he wanted to end Israel's participation in a two-state solution, his actions and those of his right-wing colleagues in the Likud have indeed brought this about. What do you think lies in store for Palestinians now? Is there anything worthwhile for them to fight for?
Well, since they live under occupation, I think most definitely there is something worth fighting for. And I think the political and diplomatic struggle for independence, for self-determination continues, because the alternative is entrenched occupation and expansion of settlements. Having said that, the Palestinians themselves need to fix their political system, and the division between Gaza and the West Bank, between the Fatah and the Hamas, doesn't help. Postponing again election after not holding one for 15 years, having a autocratic president, it's all a hindrance for them to achieve their national aspiration. Having said that, if you look at the political system in Israel, and we are in the midst of forming another coalition, it might be successful, it might not be successful, but there is a majority in the Knesset today for those who oppose a fair and just solution for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, based on two-state solution with Jerusalem as capital of both, with fair and just solution for the refugees, and so on and so forth. But again, for the Palestinian, it is important to keep working on it, either internally, domestically, in their political system, and vis-a-vis the international community, until they manage to attain their dream of statehood.
David, any comments?
Yossi, as Israel normalizes its relationship with more Arab states, I'd assume this is acting as a bit of a hurry up for the Palestinians. Is there any sign that they are finding a cohesive way to work together, or has COVID just been so disruptive in the Palestinian territories that they appear to be unable to move forward and be a more cohesive people?
You see, David, the Palestinian political system is disrupted for 15 years at least. Since the division between Hamas and Fatah after the election of 2006 and the kind of the small civil war in Gaza in 2007, I think this is detrimental to their ability to present a face to the world of how serious they're about attaining their national aspiration of the right of self-determination, and they must solve it. An election would be the first step. I think what you allude to about COVID, it just made things worse. But I think the bigger shoulder is that no one would like to discuss the issue of succession to Mahmoud Abbas. No one is talking about the ability to form a coalition, form a government that to actually represent the Palestinian people and their aspiration. In the meantime, the occupation is taking hold in a way that makes it more and more difficult to reverse. So, to be honest, whatever happens, even if you have now two perfect governments, an Israeli and a Palestinian, we need to rethink the parameters in Oslo and to be way more creative into bringing about something along of a two-state solution.
So, Yossi, what you're saying is that the two-state solution isn't dead. I mean, I've spoken to some local Palestinians here, and when you hear them talk, they're rather dejected by everything, and they say, well, look, the only thing really that seems to hold up now is that we become citizens of Israel and try to sort of work out some form of civil union between Jewish and Palestinian people in one state. Is that a more likely outcome?
I think it's a more wishful thinking, because at the end of the day, the two-state solution is probably the only realistic possibility, not because it's necessarily the most wonderful, because by definition it says that people that live in such a small territory can share it in an obvious one in one state, in a peaceful way. It would have been nice to think that there will be a state that both can express their aspiration, their dreams in one state. But this is not going to happen, not in the short run. Maybe 50 years, 100 years from now, and then we need another podcast about it. I'm always inviting myself in 50 years' time. Then we can talk about they love each other so much. They live in proximity of each other, and it's so wonderful that why do we need two states? Why do we need to spend money into administration? Let's have one. It's unrealistic. And I think probably the more realistic, and I think the new game in town is the idea of confederation, is how two people in a very small land share it in a confederal system, but at the same time in a two-state, something that both of them have the symbols of state, the Palestinian state and the Jewish state, Israel. And this probably can become more realistic, though even a confederation. It's not an easy solution to implement. It needs more thinking about the legal aspects of how in practicality you can have within, again, a tiny territory, two states working in a confederation, and still both sides feel that their aspiration for self-determination are fulfilled.
I suppose the fly in the ointment here is the nature of Jewish settlements in the West Bank. When you're trying to create a state, a nation, or a subnational grouping, it's all about land. And if, some of the primary land has been taken away from the disadvantaged group, that's going to be a problem in terms of opening up negotiations. Or what are you going to do with Jewish settlers? I mean, if they're required then to move back into Israel proper in order for the Palestinians to have a sub-state or state that makes sense to them. And again, passions run very high in that part of the world. They will make the case that there are injustices that need to be rectified in any negotiation moving forward. That does sound like Mission Impossible to me.
See, John, if I had a time machine, I would probably go back to 1974 when the first settlement started and said, just stop, look what you're doing, you're creating a situation that is impossible to resolve. But since we don't have time machines, we have to deal with the realities on the ground as they are. And there are around 600,000 settlers. And it will be almost impossible to remove not only all of them, but even 100,000, 120 from the more isolated settlement. And that's why Confederation probably, which entail that they can stay where they are, but live under Palestinian law. The same the Palestinians that move and live inside Israel will live under Israeli law. And this is in a way to square this circle, which settlements that should not have been there in the first place, that are in either practically were a huge mistake, colossal mistake by Israel, and B, they're in violation and contravention of international law. But we are in this situation, and if we say practically, how we move from this miserable situation where the Palestinians in the West Bank live under occupation and the people in Gaza are blockaded, and we can move on with that. I think probably the idea that, yes, self-determination for both is important, but not to be naive that we saw what happened in Gaza in 2005, removing 8,000 settlers was so difficult, the strain on the Israeli political system. And I happened to be in Gaza at the time to cover it. And I saw how difficult it is and how many resources we needed. We're talking 120,000 settlers to remove withdraw from the West Bank. It's such a mountain to climb. So I think that's why I'm saying we need to be more creative about the solution without losing sight that it always has to be fair and just solution for everyone. It's something that every single person live in security, taking into account the past when we're talking about the refugee, how they are compensated, how they become citizens of one or another country, but at the same time in a way that it's, at the end of the day, doable.
One thing just occurred to me while I was listening to Yossi, and that was that, yes, I also remember having seen the news footage of the difficulty that the Israeli government had in removing settlers out of Gaza. Now, the one thing that we have to also put on the table here, which makes things extremely difficult, is that the people, not all of them, obviously, but a great deal of the people who have moved into the Jewish settlements, they're not the kind of people that would necessarily take their cues from the government. They're kind of quite feisty about their own regionalism and localism. And I'm a settler. I'm like a frontiersman. I'm here. I've staked my claim, and no government's going to tell me what to do and how to go about my business. So how much will the Israeli government have in terms of managing and controlling the situation if it came to a negotiated settlement and a portion of the Jewish settlements have to be somehow moved around, for want of a better word? I mean, can we assume that there will be local resistance and, dare I say, armed resistance to this?
You know, feisty is a beautifully understatement term in relation to this paper. Like, I can think about other terms. Those are extreme, the group, and let's not lump together all the settlers, because there are a lot of, by the way, many of them are actually economic migrants. because it's cheaper to it, because you get a nicer house and better infrastructure that you can get in Tel Aviv on Haifa elsewhere. And I think this is actually the vast majority, especially those in the town closer to the Green Line or a place like Ariel. Then you have hardcore Jewish nationalistic, somehow even supremacist and messianic Jews. And I think this is the role of the country to deal with that. The state needs to assert its authority. If the sovereign body of the country decide this is going to be the solution, then if they lose control of these people, and there are a lot of signs, I think, as you imply in what you say, that the country actually is almost run, especially in the West Bank, by this group. And the policies in some parts of the West Bank are run by the most extreme of the settlers. If the state loses control, what future the state had? And I think this is a debate within Israel, why the army is serving this most extreme and isolated settlements, not only, even inside Hebron, for instance, and their behavior, which is appalling, again, violating the basic human rights of Palestinians, harassing them, burning their fields, their cars, and so on and so forth. This is for the Israeli government to think how they develop this monster within. And again, it's a small group, but let alone a very dangerous monster.
Yeah. David?
Yossi, you mentioned infrastructure then, and I was thinking about it even before you said it, that there is so much of an infrastructure investment to make sure that it's appealing for a settler to move and live in a settlement. The implications of this, of course, means that there is a really strange distribution of advanced technology and high quality infrastructure in some of Israel and most of the Palestinian territories, sort of profound under-investment and a lack of infrastructure. Is there any wiggle room for improving the physical quality of infrastructure as a way to kind of buy peace to buy time? Has this been tried and failed? Or is it a case there has to be some sort of political solution before there could be, a physical improvement in quality of life?
It's a great question. I think, if you look at it, peace is an investment. And if you believe that the dividends of peace are way bigger, greater than the dividends of war, then you invest. And it will require huge resources in this. But we saw, for instance, I would say on a smaller scale, the peace agreement between Israel and Egypt, when the United States helped Israel to build two huge model airports, airfield, inside Israel, move them from the Sinai. If there is a will, there is a way. And I think it's for the international community to decide if it was to invest in peace, because there are dividends for instance, Europe and the United States and other parts of the international community from peace between the Israeli Palestinians, and remove it from the international agenda. The same, what I think John mentioned earlier, the budding relations with the Gulf. So if everyone rallies together, and not only for the settlers and moving settlers, but also investing in the infrastructure for the Palestinians, and Gaza needs huge investment, and the West Bank, it's doable, but look at it as a long-term investment that will bear dividends. Again, look at Israel, it's actually an example, because we talk a lot about the occupation, we look at what the negative thing about Israel, but you look where it was in 1948, and where the economy, I don't like the disparities, I don't like the inequality in the Israeli society, but you look at the high-tech, if you look at the pharmaceutical, you look at the agro-technology, so how you can turn from a country basically of refugees into a country with a GDP equal to some of the most advanced countries in the world. I think this should give us some hope.
Yossi, you made mention about how Israel is starting to move in different circles now, following on from its outreach through the Abraham Accords. You've got now really good relations with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. Do you see this as a major strategic shift by Israel?
It is, if you think about it. I think to examine, and I think you mentioned something about the way that Israel sees the region. It tends to see the region and generally enemies as existential. No one is a kind of a more limited enemy It's all in terms of existential. And I think we can examine it from historical point of view, from sociological point of view. There are reasons for this. Part of it is also the rise of populism led by Netanyahu, and he makes capital gains out of this. But beyond this, the dream for Israel, the aspiration was to be accepted within the region. And if you look at the strategic situation of Israel, it's never been better in many senses. It has peace agreement with Egypt on strategic cooperation, peace agreement with Jordan, now the normalization with the EU and Bahrain, Sudan, Morocco. So Israel should feel confident. Syria is out of the secular war because it's sadly in ruin, so it can't pose a threat. So there is Iran, there is the Hezbollah in Lebanon, but it should make Israel more confident actually vis-a-vis the Palestinians to make the necessary concession for a viable peace agreement. But I'm not so sure this is the way that Israel thinks. You can use the Abraham Accord as actually as a leverage for viable, genuine peace negotiations with the support. And I think it would be nice for a change to have interlocutors or negotiators, brokers of peace within the region, and not always some of the thousands and thousands of miles away.
Yeah.
So it will give it kind of a genuine, a local flavor, if you like.
Mm.
But that's the question, because now we have also in the Gulf two paradigms. There is the one that signed the Abraham Accord, so maybe we can support a peace agreement because we have close relations. And those who adhere to the Saudi initiative, which I think there is much miles into this, that's first come peace agreement, which is fair and just with the Palestinian, and the rewards for it will wait when there is peace, in the form of full diplomatic relation. We'll see between these two paradigms what would serve best the peace with the Palestinians.
Yeah. David?
Yeah, we're in that typical problem of what comes first, the chicken or the egg. You've got a peace agreement, but is everyone in a state of mind to be able to make use of it? If we see sort of the transition that many of the Arab countries are starting, to run out of oil, they're going to need to change the nature of their economies. Their societies are going to be under new pressures because there's not money to flow to do things anymore. Do you think there is a perception from Israel's perspective that generational change in the Arab world will have a really dramatic impact on how Israel can negotiate with its neighbors sort of in the next 10 to 20 years' time as younger Arabs come to be in power with very different life experiences?
Absolutely, and I think countries in the region understand that the oil bonanza, the natural gas bonanza are not going to last forever. And we see whether in Saudi Arabia, the 2030 strategic plan. We see it in the UAE, in Oman. So there is understanding that they need to use the resources to build a more solid economies, not based on one commodity, a monoculture. Having said it, I think the interesting point is about the young generation. While the young generation, for instance, they care in principle about the Palestinians and the plight of the Palestinians, also their priorities, they are way more globalized, way more internationally educated, and they see the value of having closer relations with Israel. And I think Israel is banking on it. The question whether it makes Israel more reassured that it can also resolve as a result the conflict with the Palestinians, or it make it more complacent and think, what, we don't need to make any concession. History is on our side, and I'm saying the right side of the occupation will stay forever, annexation that was talked before the agreement, and maybe take it even further. And I think this is, again, when there is eventually a government in Israel, a stable government, I think this debate should really enter into the discourse in Israel.
Yossi, I've always believed that domestic politics has quite a significant impact on how a country is seen internationally. So having said that, with regard to Benjamin Netanyahu's serious corruption scandal, how do you think this hampers all the positive things that we can be talking about Israel reaching into the wider Arab community, developing itself in a fundamentally different way from how it used to deal with the Arab states? And also, you know, if we take the domestic situation with regard to the Palestinians, you've got a hollowed out leadership, an aging leadership. You know, some would question the competence of the leadership and, of course, the various divisions. These things speak of an inherent weakness, which is kind of scary when it comes to, you know, a country like Israel that, you know, could go up again in a serious set of armed confrontations, shall we say?
It seems, again, we're probably approaching the end of the Netanyahu era. And I know many people said it before, and it hasn't happened. As it happened, this is a day in which his mandate to form a coalition came to an end, and someone else will be handed with this task. So we might be very close to the end of Netanyahu era, and we need to think beyond. And I think the relations with the region, for too long, Israel thought itself, oh, we are based in the Middle East, but our outlook is the West. And part of it is worthwhile preserving, but also the kind of relations with the region. And at the end of the day, Israel is a Middle Eastern power, and it has to look into relation with the different power. And one of the mistakes, at least in the early days, it look at the Middle East, it's as in many ways as heterogeneous place. And now it's a complex place. And I think now Israel is gradually start to understand our relations with the Gulf, different from our relations with Syria. Is not the relations are not all the same within the Gulf, and different countries take different take. And I think this complexity of strategic thinking is trying to take hold, at least among the kind of the professional level within the bureaucracy and some of the thinkers. And this is important. Israel is not going to change the Middle East. It can contribute. It has to learn to live with the Middle East. It has to learn with the changes that are going to take place in the Middle East. And not also think that it's, you know, it tried to regime change in 82, and it was not that successful. So probably it should be discarded forever. It's how you work with actually governments and political systems that are very different from yours is the big challenge.
It seems to me, thinking about that one of the advantages at the moment, of course, is, you know, Israel and the Arab world are both very concerned about what Iran does next. And with Iran having signed a 25-year, $400 billion deal with China basically to prop it up, it provides a good, consistent time frame of my enemy's enemy is my friend.
Look, actually, just to continue on that particular point, here in Australia, you're very well aware of the fact that we are caught in the crossfire with the Chinese at the moment. And I am also curious about what Israel's position is with regard to that 25-year deal that the Chinese have, you know, made with the Iranians. Do you see this approach by China as ultimately a stabilizing factor? Because, you know, the Iranians, they're broke. I mean, they've got no economy. They've got major internal problems. They reached out to the Chinese, and the Chinese don't want to have someone that they can't control. They wouldn't be putting $400 billion into a country that will go off the reservation and do something peculiar to its interests. So do you think that this deal is ultimately in Israel's best interest to control how the Ayatollahs operate, or do you think that that has nothing to do with it at all?
I think this is one of the problem we look at Iran since 1979. There was always, again, instead of looking how complex is the political system in Iran and the factions within the regime itself, We see now, just before the election, the tensions between the more pragmatic and the more extreme within the Iranian regime. And this has been a kind of one of the things that characterized Iran for a very long time, and we didn't handle it well. Instead of empowering the more pragmatic part of Iran, we always play into their fears and their paranoia, which some of it, is justified considering what happened between 1980 and 1987, the war with Iraq, that everyone supported Iraq. Yeah. And Iran feels isolated. It doesn't justify its adventurism and the way it behaves. It probably makes little sense for it to develop military nuclear capability, which makes it a target. But at the same time, and this is probably, I will criticize the JCPOA, that it didn't go far enough in terms of being transformational. It was too transactional. Right. You limit the nuclear development or the program, and will remove the sanction, instead of thinking how Iran is becoming gradually the movement within Iran, and look at the opposition that exists in Iran and those forces that would like to change Iran from the inside, to support them by showing that there is a reward for changing policies. Now, I assume, and go back to the question of China, China, too astute to invest so much money when they think that there is going to be a war soon. No one puts so much money in a place that you think that can go up in blaze in a short while. So this can, again, China enters that where I think especially the United States under Trump made major mistakes, and see if this can change in the negotiations over the JCPOA. And B, because part of the rivalry that emerges between, this is the main game in town, in the global town, is between China and the United States. Russia, I think it's kind of a supporting act in this play. But China and the United States, the confrontation is there. And entering into the Middle East is one aspect, especially for China, the need for oil is essential.
I'm reminded about a week or so ago, wearing my other hat, hosting a radio show for Radio Adelaide, we were interviewing Professor Scott Lucas from the University of Birmingham. And we were also visiting this whole Jack Power thing. And our conversation sort of led to the idea that perhaps it wasn't comprehensive enough, and perhaps we need to revisit this whole notion of, okay, yes, it's about nuclear, but it's also about how Iran is positioning itself with ballistic missiles. Now drones are a big issue. But of course, if you bring all of those other things to the table, then Israel will also be forced to the table to look at its own order of battle and what they're willing to trade off in order for a long-lasting peace, right?
You see, but going further, to revisit an agreement, nothing wrong with revisiting an agreement, but unilaterally withdrawing from an agreement is not revisiting. It's just neglecting your duty to abide by agreement that you signed. And that's in 2018 what Trump did. And this created a worse situation. It meant that Iran became almost forced to become more entrenched in its position. Iran abide by or at least at the time, by the agreement, not by the spirit of it. I think we all agree about it, or most of us agree. Developing ballistic missiles that can reach almost any target in the region in Europe was not in line with the spirit of the JCPOA. But when it comes to the agreement itself, it exposed the flaws of the agreement. It could have been revisited instead of imposing sanctions, instead of using threatening language all the time. Is to try to renegotiate, try to see what are the trades-off between Iran and the P5+1 in negotiating it. And also not to deal only with ballistic missiles and nuclear. The role of Iran in Syria, the role of Iran in Lebanon, among the Palestinians, which is all negative. But also to try to understand it from the point of view of the Iranian. What are the Iranian interests? How they try to consolidate their own power in Iran without letting them undermine other parts of the Middle East. Because Iran is not,
There's one thing though, Iran, when we talk about Iran, it's easy to use Iran as like a black box in international relations theory, right? It's like, but Iran isn't what we think it is, because of course there's the IRCG, which is the state within the state. And of course, when we're talking about Israel and Iran, we're really talking about Israel, the state, versus the IRCG and those who support that edifice, because that's the one that's linking out to the terrorist groups and threatening Israel in a very active fashion. I mean, the Iranian armed forces are effectively a defensive force, and I think they've been starved of funds for the past 20 odd years. So what they can actually do is anyone's guess. But all the money that Iran does manage to get, or at least the Ayatollahs and their clique gets invested in the IRCG. So they get all the good stuff that they can go out and scare Israel in Lebanon, scare Israel in Syria, and wherever else it feels like it wants to do that. So if that's the case, then does any future negotiation with Iran, the state, have to take into consideration the IRCG specifically rather than Tehran more generally? I mean, I know I'm sort of trying to pull it all apart here, but what are your thoughts?
Well, I think in some places, in Lebanon in this case is similar. When you have a state within a state, now no country is a black box, all complex. Every country that we look, there is the domestic policy, and how it influences it and the relationship with other countries. So we need to look, when we negotiate with a country, when we deal with a country, we need to look at the complexities of this state. And again, the Iranian will say, what's the point for us to sign an agreement with the United States if every 4 years we get someone else? So from their point of view, if we're signing with one, with Obama, President Obama, then we get President Trump, and he decides, I don't want it anymore, and I'm not going to renegotiate. Also from their point of view, they need to look at the complexities of American politics, and they are not less complex. That's the nature of international negotiations. Now, definitely, the day with the Revolutionary Guard and having a state within a state, and who is governing the country, who is governing its foreign policy, it's a challenge. As long as Iran abides by its international commitments, the internal domestic issue we need to be aware of it, but accept that this is a different way of governing. When this becomes detrimental to the ability of the government to fulfill its commitments, international commitments, then we need to have the right to rethink the agreements altogether, and who we sign agreements, who we negotiate, what kind of tools we use. Now, it doesn't suggest that Iran doesn't pose threats in the region, because obviously it does. But there are elements there. I think the challenge for us in the West is how we empower those elements within the regime that we can rationally negotiate long-term agreements, and those with exactly the opposite. We try to reduce their power, and they understand it. The Revolutionary Guard knows that the only way for them to consolidate further and further power is confrontation. On the other hand, many Iranians understand the longer the confrontation, the less chance that the economy would improve, the society would improve. And where we are in this struggle is for us to be smarter about our policies.
To take the state inside a state thing sort of a bit sideways, we've obviously got a state inside a state in Lebanon, and the Lebanese state does really seem to be very close, to the end of its rope. An Iranian desire to probably create havoc will only increase, I imagine. What do you imagine Lebanon is heading towards, and is there any chance the region as a whole, could work together in a cohesive manner to support the Lebanese state before it implodes?
I think the region should support, and not only the region, but the international community, definitely countries like France that historically, traditionally have interest in Lebanon. The question, how you fix Lebanon? Because everything that, governance in Lebanon is based on a census from the 1930s, an agreement, the agreement that is irrelevant to the demography of 2021. And no one has the courage to try to change it, because they know that if it's like opening a Pandora box. So they almost prefer to continue this dysfunctionality than try to resolve it, because resolving it, think about the memory of the Civil War, 1976 until the Taif Agreement. This is within living memory. And the fear that if you touch the system as it is, you might go back to a civil war. And we saw the demonstration back in 2019, early 2020. And there was a hope there, because the coalition of those who protested were not along a religious lines. But you saw a lot of young people, whether they're Christians, Maronites, or Shiite, or Sunni, actually play with the system. You need to change, because it doesn't serve us. But between COVID and then what happened in the port in Beirut, it doesn't seem that there are the forces there that are ready to take any chance. And the same with the international community won't take responsibility to get involved, because you saw what happened in the past, whether it's the civil war or Syrian intervention and Israeli invasion and trying regime change. So they keep it as it is until it explodes. And the fear that at one point or another, it might explode.
North of Israel, of course, is Syria, and there is a significant Russian military and private military presence, arguably there to secure its significant and long-standing eastern Mediterranean footholds in the naval port of Tartus and its airfield in Khmeimim in Latakia province. Describe for us, Yossi, if you can, Israel's relations with Russia, and more particularly Netanyahu's relations with Russian President Vladimir Putin.
I think Netanyahu and Putin understand each other, probably in a way that we don't understand and even don't want to. And Israel developed close enough relations with Russia and understanding definitely in Syria. And Israel would have not bombed Syria the way it does or operate within Syria without Russia agree. Moscow agrees to that. And when the friction mistakes taking place, they have their own mechanism to resolve it very, very quickly. Israel understands also Russian interests, which are kind of historical interests in the Mediterranean. Russia, give or take, is closer to the neighborhood than the United States. So for Israel, again, as this is a small country, is understand and try to go between China, Russia, the United States. And so far, they managed to do that for all sorts of reasons. But as far as Syria, for instance, there is a commonality of interest between Russia and Israel not to let the Iranians to consolidate their force within Syria. Allies in one way, Iran and Russia, but as long as they don't consolidate the power, because for obvious reason, the Russians want to see Iran too strong there. So they don't mind Israel operating within Syria and hit the Iranians, making sure that some of the weapons, whenever they can stop, go to the Hezbollah. The main danger is actually come to Israel from the Hezbollah because of the way they're armed. Before there might be a motivation, one point or another, to use it, especially if Iran feels threatened by Israel. And this combination makes Israeli anxious. But as far as Russia is concerned, they're good enough strategic understanding between the two.
In terms of Russia's relationship in the neighborhood, clearly it's had the long-term interests in Syria. Is there any evidence that they may become involved in Lebanon? Are they one of the few international players that, again, has these deep links to the region, and it's in their interest to be involved so that the Americans aren't?
I think most countries avoid intervening in Lebanon because they know that it's very difficult to resolve it. You get yourself into a situation. I think Russia learned the experience in other places in the world, like in Afghanistan. When you enter, you never know when you get out of these places. And you find yourself, as we see the United States in Afghanistan, 20 years later, and very, very few achievements, if at all. So the UN and the Russians in this sense are, I think, smarter not to get involved in Lebanon. They saw every force that enter into Lebanon and that injured, damaged by this experience. They, I think, in this sense, again, another commonality between Israel and Russia. They define their strategic aims very clearly, and they managed to adhere to that throughout the last 10 years. And so far, from their point of view, they haven't diverted from this strategic targets or aims. And a diversion of this objective will be actually entering into Lebanese politics. And I don't think Russia would like to do that.
Well, I mean, there's always France. They're always looking for a gig. I can go back into Lebanon and try there.
They like going to places where there's a big mess and throwing their hands in the air.
Yep. Anyway, with the election, oh, sorry.
No, I think with France, there always will come a big declaration, but nothing would follow.
Yeah, followed by a shrug.
Oh, we are so unkind. Sorry, France, if you're listening.
We're going to get their submarines if they ever work, so we'll make it up to them then.
Okay.
Well, I'm living closer to France, so I have to be nicer.
Yeah, you actually do. Yossi, with the election of Joe Biden as US president, it seems that the relatively easygoing and affable relationship Netanyahu enjoyed with former President Donald Trump is well and truly over. Can Israel afford to have sour relations with Washington?
The simple answer, no, it can't. But at the same time, every American president has the constraints how much it can strain relations with Israel. And no one more than Netanyahu. no one more than Netanyahu know to play this. Cast your mind to his famous or infamous speech in Congress, just during the negotiation, the JCPOA negotiation. This was, very, very, very serious. And he took liberty to intervene in domestic American politics because he knew he could. So I think that at the end of the day, Israel and the United States know the limit of this game. But there are real strategic importance for both of them, in cooperation between the two. So I think, yes, you're not going to have the same relation with Biden. But I think there is a kind of misnomer about the relation between Netanyahu and Trump. I think Netanyahu was quite fearful of the unpredictability of Trump, at least with Biden. Yeah, obviously, we were terrified about, because when you live between tweet and tweet, you don't know what comes next. I think what I'm trying to say, and I try to say it more elegantly, is that it might be the case eventually when we look back at the 4 years that, Trump was in Netanyahu's pocket, if you like. He would follow his. But Netanyahu didn't know that because he knew that Trump was unpredictable. And if you just put your foot a millimeter out of what is Trump's ability to tolerate, there will be repercussions. So he was, in a way, cautious about dealing with Trump. Because I give you an example, he could have annexed part of the West Bank, but he didn't. Actually, the Abraham Accords helped him to climb down from this idiocy of trying to annex parts of the West Bank. Trump, because it's misunderstanding not only in the Middle East, but most things around the world, wouldn't mind one way or another. It might look like a good idea, let's do it. What are the kind of the long-term implication of that? Trump didn't do long-term. Sure. It's came in a tweet the next morning. So I think this Netanyahu, in many ways, while others, for instance, at the early days of Trump, there are some that really pushed Netanyahu, go and annex, build more settlements, take some far-reaching policies when it is the Palestinians. Netanyahu, who, by the way, naturally cautious, was more cautious than other members of government or the right wing in Israel because of the unpredictability. I think again, we don't know for how long Netanyahu is staying in power. And it doesn't mean that it means that there is a dovish, peace-loving government will appear in Israel all of a sudden. But with Biden, there are two things. A, there is more predictability. B, he surprises us, all of us, in his policies. We thought this gentleman will enter and will be almost in a holding position for 4 years. And then we'll get probably some of the most revolutionary policies within his first 100 days. So he thinks that he's on a mission. The question, if he's ready, while he has a global agenda, he has a domestic agenda that is far-reaching, to say, do I need to get also into confrontation with Israel on something that I have very little chance to succeed? Right. I don't have the answer, but I doubt if he's going to do that.
Okay. David?
To pick up on that point, again, Sleepy Joe has suddenly become motivated. We might even call him Progressive Joe, which is something I never thought I'd say with a video camera on. But again, we don't really see, well, other than people like AOC, what young American politics is going to look like in 10 years' time. Do you have a sense, what are young Israeli politicians like? Is there going to be a natural and meaningful generational change at some point? Or have so many of the current significant players in Israeli politics been there so long that they've essentially groomed junior politicians to be mirror images?
Yeah, let me say something about Biden because I'm grappling with this phenomenon in the, writing about it. I think we should reconsider our ageism, which we do really badly in thinking we actually projecting our own biases about someone at his age coming to the White House and being able. Actually, and it's, I think, a lesson for all of us. You bring someone with so much experience, we think, you know what, I might have only 4 years to be in the White House. I'm going to achieve something because I don't owe anyone anything. I'm going to leave my mark in a way maybe that a younger president will never think, I have midterm and I have another term maybe, and then I will have to live 30, 40 years. Or as you see with Jimmy Carter, since 19, more than 40 years after leaving the White House, he said, I'm going to make a change, which I think it's a lesson beyond the United States. And also kind of a note for ourselves about our own biases and prejudices. Having said that, unfortunately, the last 20, 30 years left almost from leadership point of view in Israel, it's bare. And you don't see, because what happens to a lot of young, talented people in Israel, they found outlet, their talent and their abilities elsewhere, in the high tech, the economy, in other parts, in academia, in culture. The film industry in Israel is prospering these days. Or they went and lived elsewhere. And politics remained quite a sad place in which very capable people say, we don't want to touch, it's corrupt, it's incompetent, it's run by someone that likes cigars and champagne and think that's fair to get from friends. Just now, this is a huge challenge for me, to have a cadre of leaders that we are ready to take on Israeli politics, to be there. And have one thing you can say about Netanyahu, he had the desire, he had the stamina that others didn't. And, the issue of leadership is always kind of big enigma. Where do you find it? When does it emerge? What are the conditions that will happen? I think Israel needs young leadership that is, or more than young leadership, good leadership, a combination that is a representative of the Israeli society, which is, again, we haven't talked much about it, which is also very divided. And we saw from events in the last few days in Israel, how you also have an autonomy of huge group of people within the society. So someone that can bring, instead of Netanyahu's populism that thrives on division, people that can bring it together despite the differences within the Israeli society.
There was one thing that came up, and that was that at the moment, because of Netanyahu's populism, it has driven a lot of younger Israelis to leave Israel, go to Europe. Even places like Germany seem like a nice place to live these days, because they don't believe that Israel is as progressive as it should be. They believe that Netanyahu is not to their taste. How has this actually affected Israel's body politic? I mean, if we're talking about the young people taking over from the old guard, well, if some of your more seriously talented young people have thought, I've had a gut full of Israel, I don't feel safe or secure here under Netanyahu's stewardship, what is there left in terms of talent moving on?
I think, again, Israel is always, it's a lot of zoom in, zoom out. Wherever you focus, you see different things. And though there is outlet, as I mentioned, for many young people in the high tech and in other areas, in culture, in academia, even serving in the security forces to fulfill their aspiration, there are all those who just give up and say, they move out of the country. And, I don't want to be a hypocrite because I did it many years ago. You mentioned Berlin. I have a niece that lives in Berlin. And there was the big issue of the cost of some of the desserts that are much cheaper in Berlin, the milky. That was much cheaper in Berlin than in Tel Aviv. It's also, for the young generation, Israel became very expensive, not affordable anymore. So they're looking for other places, and also not to live constantly, many of, those who decide to live between, it's not only the military service, then you serve another 20 years in reserves, and you don't want necessarily your children to live like this. And then, at least in the early days, there was the idea that everyone is in it together. And when you have a capitalist system on steroids, sort of a Thatcherite, Reagan government that believe in free markets in a way that creates inequality within the society, said, so we're not all in it together. Some are becoming billionaires and we can't afford living, paying rent. Then they look elsewhere. It's not, there are similar phenomena, but when in a country that you expect people also to have security issue and serve 3-4 years in the military, give you some of your best years. And then while you are, for instance, a student, or start your own business, start a family, to spend like 30 days in reserves every year. And at the same time, there are people like the ultra-Orthodox that don't serve a single day, many of them, and many of them living on benefits that those who pay taxes have to pay for it. Then people start thinking, you know what, we have to look after ourselves and our families.
Yeah.
And that's from the ability of the society to stay coherent and united. It's a big issue.
Mm-hmm. I've got a couple of questions. These will be the last 2 questions for you, Yossi, so you can then go off and do your Al Jazeera. So look, regarding Europe and the European states, which are the most important to Israel and why? Does Israel place more emphasis on its dealings with the EU as a whole, or does it prefer bilateral state-to-state ties?
It's a good question. I'm not trying to avoid the question, but the easy answer is to say both. Right. It depends on what issue. There is the outlook of the EU as an EU, as an economic partner, as scientific partner. And this is important also, considering that Israel is on the doorstep of Europe. In many ways, the EU as a bloc is important. On the other hand, there are different relations. Okay, the UK now is not part of the EU, but the relations on the military relations, for instance, sharing intelligence, political relations, part of from the economic relation with the UK always been stronger. Germany always play a different part because of history between it. So there are specific countries where kind of relations evolve differently. And also the economic interest. Again, as we know, and I think because of the corruption investigation, everyone knows now that Israel buys submarines from Germany. And there is strategic reason, but allegedly there are also for some people economic interest in that, but which is separately. So there are different relations, for instance, with other countries. East Europe, for instance, when it comes to supporting the relations with the Palestinians, or the kind of the populism that we see in parts of East Europe, plays more into the hands of the right wing in Israel. So again, I think you move between the two, the specific and the EU as well, and both of them are vastly important to Israel.
Just speaking about, being just on the outside of Europe and looking in, what are Israel's relations with Turkey like?
Well, it's the meeting of the two populists. When you have a national populist and a religious national populist in two countries, and they play one. If you think strategically, Turkey and Israel are very important for each other. And this was until 2010 and the Marmara fiasco with the flotilla to Gaza. Relations were very close. You talk about with military people, diplomats in Turkey, said the relations between Turkey and Israel are very significant vis-a-vis the region. Now we see the shift that Israel signs a strategic agreement with Greece, for instance, and the new alliance with Greece and Cyprus in the Eastern Mediterranean. But all along it was Turkey as a major power, as a member of NATO. But both countries went through domestic changes that affects the relations between them. And in the long term, I can see close relation between Israel and Turkey. And there still have, by the way, behind the scene, much of it does exist. But as long as Netanyahu and Erdogan are the one in the helm, I think this kind of friction would continue because they are the master of scoring cheap points for domestic reasons at the expense of their national interests.
Well, on that note, everyone, that's a wrap. My thanks to our special guest, Professor Yossi Meckelberg, for being on Strategicon. My thanks to co-host David Olney for his contributions, and to our audience, thanks for listening. We hope that you'll join us for our next exciting adventure through the world of geopolitics. Remember that you can subscribe to the audio version of Strategicon through the Ozcast network, iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, and Spotify. And please like us on the Sage International Facebook site and follow us on Twitter. We appreciate your support. You can also watch our podcasts on video through the Strategicon Raw YouTube channel when they are available, easily accessed by clicking on the link provided on our website. Also, please comment on any of our articles and podcasts through Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and of course on the Sage International site. We welcome any constructive feedback that can help improve our products, and we look forward to engaging with our followers. If you would like to support Strategicon, remember to check out our merch page. We have a wide variety of items to keep the Strategicon listeners satisfied. Until next time, goodbye.